Exhaustion perks are survivor perks that give a bonus, usually a speed boost, at the cost of the exhausted status effect. This effect acts like a cooldown, preventing you from activating these perks multiple times in a row. Back when DBD first came out, exhaustion didn't exist. It wasn't mentioned in perk descriptions, nor was it displayed on the HUD. But that doesn't mean speed boost perks from that era had no cooldown. They did, but it was built into the perks themselves, indicated by an overlay on their icons moving counterclockwise. The first difference between the inbuilt cooldown and exhaustion was that the latter would roll back while running, which allowed survivors to speed up multiple times during a single chase. Sounds pretty wild, but to really show just how wild it was, let's look at how it worked in practice using specific perks as examples. One of the first perks that we classify as an exhaustion perk today was Sprint Burst. Native to Mac Thomas, it speeds you up by 50% for 3 seconds the moment you start running. Today it has a 40-second cooldown, but at the start it was half that, which unlocked almost infinite possibilities during a chase. Even a bad survivor could easily last 20 seconds in a chase, so if they had Sprint Burst, at least one rollback was guaranteed. And now imagine what a good survivor could do with that. Sadly, I wasn't around to experience this version of Sprint Burst myself, so I can't tell you how it felt in a real match. But when we were doing some random 1v1 chases for this video, we sometimes managed to activate it up to 5 times. Though to be fair, there probably weren't that many good players at that time, because the game was new and most people had absolutely no idea what they were doing. But still, that goes to show how naive behaviors balancing choices were back then. To their credit though, they didn't let this version of Sprint Burst wreak havoc for too long. 2 weeks after the game launched, it was nerfed for the first time. Its cooldown was increased to 40 seconds, which made it better, but not by much. The 2016 maps had much higher pallet density, which allowed survivors to compensate for the extra 20 seconds in a chase, still letting them speed up multiple times like before. Seeing how this nerf didn't suffice at the end of 2016, behavior made it so that running slowed down cooldown recovery by 50%. Naturally, it didn't fix the perk completely, but it made it a little less annoying, because survivors couldn't spam it as often anymore. The second difference was that unlike exhaustion, the built-in cooldown wasn't shared between different speed-up perks. Each had its own completely independent cooldown. This meant that if you brought several of them, using one wouldn't automatically disable the others, allowing you to chain them back to back and gain an abnormal amount of distance from the killer. Originally, besides Sprint Burst, there was only one other speed boost perk, Adrenaline. Also belonging to Mag, it activates when the exit gates are powered. Just like Sprint Burst, it gives you a 50% speed boost for 3 seconds, but on top of that it also heals you for 1 health state. At the start it had one major drawback: it didn't pause when you were disabled, as in being carried or hooked. In this case it would simply go to waste. Sometimes just partially, for example you managed to wiggle off before the effect elapsed, and sometimes completely. But such was the price to pay for the 5-second speed boost duration. Basically, by timing your adrenaline to kick in right before or after Sprint Burst, you got 8 seconds of zooming around the map that only the hillbilly could counter. In August 2016, the situation got worse because balanced landing was added to the game. This perk speeds you up by 50% for 3 seconds when you fall from an elevation, after which it goes on a 40-second cooldown. To make sure the speed boost doesn't get wasted due to the fall stagger, the devs also made it reduce the fall stagger by 75%. Originally, this perk had much more humble properties. It sped you up for only 2 seconds and its cooldown was a full minute. However, to compensate for that, its fall stagger reduction applied not only to the initial fall but to all falls, even when the perk was on cooldown. It was extremely abusable, because it turned a lot of 2-floor tiles into some of the most disgusting infinites in the game. This was especially true for buildings on the old Haddonfield. They were super survivor-sided even without any perks, but with balanced landing they became absolutely unbearable for killers. Just like Adrenaline, the effect of balanced landing was also stackable. And just imagine the kind of impact it had on the game when combined with Sprint Burst, or better yet Sprint Burst and Adrenaline. I don't know if anyone ever tried that in a real chase, but in KYF it sure looked funny as hell. About 5 months after the initial nerf to Sprint Burst, the devs standardized the effect of balanced landing by increasing its speed boost duration to 3 seconds and reducing its cooldown to 40 seconds. This made stacking it with Sprint Burst and Adrenaline even more efficient, and apparently that was the straw that broke the camel's back, because in the spring of 2017 all speed boost perks were finally separated and put into their own lanes. Right before the release of the Doctor, the inbuilt cooldown of speed boost perks was replaced with the exhaustion mechanic. When exhaustion took effect, the survivor received the exhausted status effect, which appeared on the HUD as a small heart icon. Its outline served as the new cooldown indicator, replacing the old overlay system. By that time, 40 seconds had become the de facto standard for speed boost perk cooldowns. When updating them with exhaustion, the devs decided not to reinvent the wheel and keep this as the default rollback time. Since exhaustion was shared by all speed boost perks, it was no longer possible to chain multiple of them. Once the first one triggered, the others would automatically deactivate until the exhaustion meter rolled back. The first version of Exhaustion basically imitated the Spring Burst old cooldown system. It rolled back at full speed when walking, standing or crouching, and at half speed when running. This was a direct nerf to balanced landing. Before Exhaustion, its cooldown recovered at full speed no matter what, so you could use it every 40 seconds even if you never stopped running during a chase. Now with that playstyle, you had to get used to an 80-second timer, just like Spring Burst users. But to be honest, it wasn't that big of a deal, so people continued running it just like before, especially since the fall stagger reduction it provided still had no cooldown, meaning you could still abuse the f**k out of 2 floor loops on Crotosprang, Haddonfield, Blood Lodge, and other similar maps. To make sure survivors wouldn't lose their mind over such a massive nerf to their favorite perks, the devs sugar-coated it with some cosmetic buffs. First, they made Exhaustion roll back 33% faster while crouching, letting you recover it in just 28 seconds. Sure, in a real chase you wouldn't get the full value, cause the killer's pressure wouldn't let you crouch too much, but if you pre-drop smartly, it could sometimes come in clutch. Second, they buffed Adrenaline. Now it paused if the survivor was disabled, meaning that it was no longer possible to waste even a second of its speed boost. Unlike its healing effect. Behavior did make it so it healed you off the hook, but somehow not when you wiggled off. That was weird and inconsistent, so they fixed that shortly after the release of Freddy. This made an already strong perk downright god tier, which the devs didn't seem to mind for about 6 years. Then they suddenly remembered it existed and decided to tone it down by cutting its speed boost to 3 seconds and reverting the pause while disabled thing. But even after that, it remained one of the most popular survivor perks, and as a chronic Adrenaline user, I can confirm it's well deserved. That feeling when the last gen pops and you speed up right in the killer's face is just ooh. Balanced Landing suffered the same fate. At the end of 2019, it got a new property that made it muffle all falling sounds, so killers could no longer tell when you jumped down unless they had a direct line of sight to you. Kinda useful, but let's be real, it wasn't added to make the perk stronger. The real purpose was to distract survivors from the fact that in this patch, Balanced Landing lost its ability to reduce fall stagger while exhausted. That meant no more abusing 2 floor loops, which honestly was the right call, but personally I would have handled it differently. I would have still removed the fall stagger reduction while exhausted, but instead of deleting it from the game entirely, I would have made it a separate perk that couldn't stack with Balanced Landing's fall stagger reduction. And most importantly, I would have reworked the abusable 2 floor spots, because let's face it, that was the actual root of the problem. The first speed boost perk added after the introduction of Exhaustion was Lithe. Just like today, its first iteration gave you a 50% speed boost for 3 seconds after mid or fast vaulting, but here's the catch. It could only be activated during a chase. Outside of that, nothing happened. You just ran at default speed. And that was pretty wild, because there's never been another Exhaustion perk with such a limitation. It was both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, when the killer wasn't on you, it made moving around the map faster and more convenient, because you didn't have to waste time walking around windows or slow vaulting them just to avoid triggering Lithe too early. On the other hand, it meant that if, for example, one of your teammates was about to die on hook, you couldn't give yourself that extra speed boost to unhook them in time. Personally, this limitation didn't bother me much, but since other perks didn't have it, I can't pretend I don't understand why most players saw it as unfair, which eventually led to the devs to remove it in spring 2019. By the time Lithe was added to the game, the speed up meta, or I guess we can now call it the Exhaustion meta, had been fully established. Seeing all 4 survivors running Exhaustion perks had become business as usual. Realistically, it had happened much earlier, probably sometime back in 2016, but the motivation for running these perks was different then. People did it because it just felt natural. A huge part of survivor gameplay is getting chased, so why not bring a perk that lets you run faster? But the thing is, you didn't really need to run faster. With much higher pallet density, unblockable windows, fast vaults without a running start, no bloodlust, and many other broken things, you could easily keep the killer busy for 5 minutes or more without any extra speed boost. By 2017 though, the situation had changed. Not that the game was completely fixed, it still hasn't been even after 9 years, but it had been fixed enough for survivors to shift their playstyle away from abusing one window the entire match and toward moving around the map and keeping as much distance from the killer as possible. And that's when Exhaustion perks really took center stage. The king of them was of course Spring Burst, because it had the fewest activation requirements, which made it the easiest one to use. However, soon a strong rival appeared. With the Huntress DLC, the roster of Exhaustion perks was expanded with Dead Heart, and that split the game into a before and after. In its original form, this perk worked pretty much like Spring Burst on button. It didn't require you to get hooked to activate, it was immediately available the moment you got injured. You just needed to press E or whatever the f you use on controller, and it would charge you forward about 3 meters, letting you dodge the killer's attack. This design was problematic on so many levels, I don't even know where to start. Okay, first of all, it gave survivors way too much control during a chase. They they no longer had to worry about rolling back exhaustion like with Spring Burst or plan the chase around windows or hills like with Lithe and Balance Landing. Dead Hard was always ready exactly when they needed it. Second, it was much harder to wait out. Today it's a very popular trick to make survivors waste their Dead Hard. You catch up with them but don't swing right away. Instead you wait for them to reveal their Dead Hard and only then swing. With the old Dead Hard it wasn't that easy. Since it made you dash forward unless you wanted to show off and make the killer whiff, there was zero reason to ever let them get close to you. You could just Dead Hard for distance while they were still several meters behind and safely make it to a nearby pallet or window. Dead Harding for distance also allowed you to extend loops by greeting the pallet one extra time, and not even the Doctor's shock stunt could counter that, because during the Dead Hard animation, survivors lost their hitbox so they could run right through it and still drop the pallet. Naturally, soon after its introduction, Dead Hard took Dead by Daylight by storm, not just because it was crazy strong, but also because it was free. I can't say if it completely overshadowed Spring Burst, but even if it didn't, it definitely wasn't far behind. Somewhere around the peak's release, all exhaustion perks except Dead Hard were updated with the haste icon to show their active time. Why not Dead Hard? I don't know, but I've got one schizo theory. It might have been Behavior's way of saying they didn't recognize it as an actual speed-up perk, thus indirectly invalidating the complaints about survivors using it for distance. Until recently, this change was purely cosmetic, because just like the cooldown before the introduction of exhaustion, the active time was already displayed on the HUD through the overlay on the perk icon. The haste icon simply took over that functionality, but since patch 8.7.0, it also started showing the strength of the effect as a percentage, so I guess that actually makes it useful now. What's funny is that before the haste icon was added to the exhaustion perks, it had been in the game for a good 9 months. If you trust the DBD wiki, it was added in patch 1.5.2. In reality, it happened even earlier, in patch 1.5.0 with the introduction of exhaustion. It's just back then it applied exclusively to Hope. By the way, speaking of the DBD wiki, it's a super useful tool and as you can see, I rely a lot on it in my videos. However, I recently learned that this project isn't doing very well. For some reason, the team behind it decided to abandon the original wiki and start a new one, but since they somehow can't take down the original, the new one is basically competing with it for search engine rankings, and it's not winning. This is really bad, because if it keeps going this way, the project might die entirely, and I really don't want it to happen. Not just as a content creator, but also as a regular player who likes digging up interesting facts about my favorite perks and characters. So if you use the DBD wiki at all, forget about the old one. It's dead and it's not being updated anymore. Use the new one instead. I'll put the link to it in the description. Fingers crossed that with our help it's gonna survive. 6 months later, one of the biggest shifts in the exhaustion meta happened. That's when exhaustion was nerfed to no longer roll back while running. On top of that, several months earlier, the devs had removed the functionality of accelerated exhaustion recovery while crouching, which together made using exhaustion perks multiple times in a single chase much more difficult. Now to pull it off, you had to switch to walking every chance you got. This way, the exhaustion timer would periodically unfreeze and roll back little by little. The perk hit hardest by this nerf was Sprint Burst. Before it, the fact that it activated as soon as you started running was its biggest advantage, because it made it super easy to use. Sure, it often meant that it was on cooldown by the time the chase started, but for experienced players that was even better, because it allowed them to avoid revealing it to the killer right off the bat and keep it for later when they wouldn't expect it. After the exhaustion nerf, if Sprint Burst wasn't ready by the start of the chase, there was a risk you'd never get to use it at all. Depending on the map RNG and the killer's playstyle, there was a good chance you simply wouldn't get enough walking time for exhaustion to roll back. On the bright side, the freezing exhaustion timer gave rise to the 99 tech. That's when you roll back Sprint Burst until it's just about to activate and start running again to keep it that way. Once the chase starts and the killer gets too close, you let go of shift for a moment, roll back your exhaustion completely and Sprint Burst away just as they swing. If you wanted to use Sprint Burst efficiently after that patch, it was recommended to run it with Vigil. Belonging to Quentin Smith, it originally increased the recovery of Hindered, Mangle, Blindness, Hemorrhage, but most importantly exhaustion by 20% for you and your teammates within 8 meters. At first nobody gave a f about this perk, but after the exhaustion nerf, players who refused to give up on Sprint Burst suddenly found it useful. And I don't know how, but over time this perk got buffed so much it actually became meta. The list of things it applies to now includes pretty much every negative status effect in the game. It decreases their duration by 40%, works at twice the range, and lingers for 15 seconds after survivors leave it. It's massively overtuned even when just one survivor has it, but when there are 4 of them in the lobby, it basically brings back the days of the original original Sprint Burst, because Vigil's effect is stackable, making exhaustion roll back literally at the speed of light. I swear, there are 3 things you can watch forever: fire burning, water falling, and behavior fixing issues, only to reintroduce them later in a new form. Anyhow, Vigil failed to save Sprint Burst from losing its status as the most popular exhaustion perk. It didn't disappear from the radar completely, far from that, but the community en masse was definitely past it, with the majority now preferring Dead Hard. And that's when the brokenness of this perk became even more apparent. Initially, the devs tried to fix it with small quality of life updates. The first thing they did was improve its visibility to the killer. See, originally it was pretty hard to tell when it was in use. It didn't have a dedicated animation, and its completely flat speed curve often made killers mistake it for random lag spikes. So in patch 1.9.1, the speed curve was readjusted to make it look more like a dash, and later in patch 2.0.0, Dead Hard finally received its distinct dabbing animation. Also in 2.0.0, the devs removed Dead Hard's ability to speed up survivors in the air, because it let them jump over small holes and gain extra distance in a chase. Behavior considered it a bannable exploit and heavily discouraged players from using it. But honestly, it wasn't that bad, because most of the time killers could counter it with a simple lunge attack, which also carried them over the hole. Still, fixing this was the right call, because aside from jumping over holes, survivors also used it to reach spots that were completely off limits for killers, letting them hold them hostage indefinitely. Naturally, these minor tweaks didn't cut it. If anything, killers' frustration with Dead Hard was only growing, and after 4 years of non-stop complaints, behavior finally caved and completely reworked it. The new version no longer provided a speed boost. Instead, it gave 0.5 seconds of endurance, which essentially acted like a parry, allowing you to eat a killer's attack in exchange for a deep wound. This finally gave killers a fair counterplay against this perk, because now they could just wait it out like I explained earlier. The only problem was that they had to do a lot of waiting. See, unlike today, that version of Dead Hard didn't require survivors to get hooked to activate it, which meant that there was no cap on how many times it could be used. And with how popular this perk was, it basically meant you couldn't down anyone without dancing around them for several seconds first. That was super annoying, especially when after the match you realized that the survivor you had been trying to outplay didn't even have Dead Hard. But you had to do it anyway. One good Dead Hard could easily cost you a match, so you just had to be paranoid and play as if everyone had it. This version of Dead Hard tortured killers for 9 months, until in patch 6.7.0 it was finally nerfed to activate only after you had been unhooked or unhooked yourself. Once you used it, it deactivated, and to get it back you had to get hooked again. This limited how many times it could be used to just 2, which tremendously reduced its presence in the match. That brings us to the present day, where the perk is still extremely powerful but nowhere near the state it used to be in back in 2017. And just like with Sprint Burst after the nerf to exhaustion rollback, the Dead Hard nerf made it give way to the next best perk in the list, Life. Right now it's the most popular exhaustion perk in the game and the second most popular survivor perk overall. Meanwhile, behavior continued to pump out new exhaustion perks. In the spring of 2019, we got Head-On. Just like Dead Hard, Head-On doesn't speed survivors up. Instead, after you've been in a locker for 3 seconds, it allows you to stun the killer when you jump out of it. At first, it wasn't anything game-breaking. A bit annoying for killers, sure, but nothing worth bitching about. But about 6 months ago, that changed. That's when the devs reversed the priority of actions for killers trying to pick up down survivors near lockers. Originally, in this situation, the game would prompt the killer to open the locker first. After the update, it started prioritizing picking up survivors instead. This made it possible for Head-On users to force a scenario where they could save each other on loop, making it impossible for the killer to hook them. You needed 2 survivors for this, both running Head-On and Vigil. One would hide in a locker and the other would go down right in front of it. This would block the locker prompt for the killer, leaving them no choice but to pick the survivor up. Once they did, the survivor in the locker would stun them and make them drop their teammate. After that, they needed to quickly swap roles and do the whole thing again. Assuming both Head-Ons were now on cooldown, the killer would most likely try to pick the survivor up for the 3rd time, but that would be a mistake, because thanks to the double Vigil, there was essentially no cooldown, so the survivors would just keep stunning them over and over again until the killer finally gave up and walked away. And I know that no one at Behavior watches my videos, so what I'm about to say is gonna fall on deaf ears, but still. Guys, it's been 9 years. It's about time you give us a dedicated button for interactable objects. Stuff like this wouldn't happen if you didn't tie literally every action in the game to the spacebar. 2 years later, we got Smash Hit. It speeds you up after you stun the killer with a pallet, and it's a bit of a special case because unlike most other exhaustion perks, it doesn't use the standard values. Yes, the haste it provides is still 50%, but it lasts 4 seconds instead of the usual 3, and since patch 7.1.0, it's had a 20-second cooldown instead of 40. Generally, I like this approach, because it gives the devs more flexibility to fine-tune perk balance. But right now, thanks to the whole Vigil situation, this perk isn't in a healthy state. Quadruple Vigil lets you roll it back in just a few seconds, and the only reason it hasn't completely broken the game is that most players simply avoid it, which is fair. I mean, who wants to run a perk whose value depends entirely on whether the killer respects pallets or not? 8 months later, the devs gave us Overcome. While other exhaustion perks grant a separate speed boost effect, Overcome extends the one you get after being hit by 2 seconds, which makes it the ultimate Shift W tool. Spring of 2023 saw the release of Background Player. This perk speeds you up by 50% for a whopping 5 seconds when the killer picks someone up, making it the perfect choice for players who like to go for flashlight and flashbang saves. Just like Smash Hit, its cooldown is only 20 seconds, so you get to use it a lot during the match. One part of me really likes this perk. I can't even count how many tasty clips I've farmed with it. But the other part kinda despises it for how easy it's made saving teammates. It used to be an art, it used to mean something, and now anyone with 3 hours on record can pull it off with their eyes closed. My other gripe with this perk is how safe it is. 5 seconds is such a long duration that it's enough not only to save your teammate but also to run miles away from the killer afterward. And that's just flat out wrong. Even the rescued survivor doesn't get that much distance, so why should you? If anything, you should stay closer and take the aggro. And mind you, that's the nerfed version of the perk. Before patch 8.0.0, the haze bonus it provided was 100%, so it used to be even more brain dead. The most recent exhaustion perk is Dramaturgy, which was added in the summer of 2023. It gives you 25% haste for 2 seconds, followed by one of the following effects: Screaming, receiving a rare item with random add-ons, extending the haste duration by another 2 seconds, or becoming exposed for 12 seconds. It's basically a meme perk that flew under the radar for a while, but in the end of 2024 its popularity suddenly spiked. The reason for this is that, well, people learn how to use it. The thing is, it activates on button press, which if you roll the extra 2 seconds of haste, basically makes it work like the old Dead Hard. So as you can see, the exhaustion meta has been going strong for 9 years straight, and at this point it's safe to say that it's not going anywhere. And that's fine, I just wish Behavior's balancing team would finally start learning from their past mistakes and stick to safer numbers when creating new exhaustion perks or reworking the old ones. Otherwise we'll be stuck in an endless cycle of pointless buffs and nerfs forever.